Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a tale woven with silk sheets, steel daggers, and scandalous whispers that echoed through medieval stone corridors. Before you settle in, make sure the lights are dim, maybe let a gentle fan hum in the background. We're about to journey back to a time where queens didn't just rule, they rewrote the rules entirely. And trust me, you're not ready for how far they went. Our first stop takes us to the sun-kissed courts of Naples in the 14th century, where one woman wore her crown not just as a symbol of rule, but as a challenge to the entire concept of royal decorum. Joanna of Naples, crowned in 1343, wasn't interested in following tradition like a well-behaved heir. Where others saw duty, she saw loopholes. Where most queens took one husband, she collected four, and each with a story soaked in both romance and unease. Her first marriage didn't last the year. Her husband, Andrew of Hungary, met a chilling end, found dangling from a window frame like a discarded puppet. The official story was an accident. The unofficial ones? Well, they were less forgiving. Yet Joanna moved on, undeterred, as if matrimony was simply a formality she could rewrite with each ring she wore. Whispers soon followed her like a shadow. Among the most infamous stories, whether fact or fabrication, was the rumor of a bedchamber trap. It was said that beneath her ornate mattress lay a hidden mechanism, a trap door that opened not with a creak, but with sudden finality. Suitors who pleased her might spend the night in velvet and candlelight. Those who didn't, they vanished, disappearing down into the murky moat below, swallowed whole by silence and water. Truth? Perhaps not. But legend? Oh yes, and legends like that don't just sprout from nothing. Joanna knew how to command not only armies and alliances, but attention. In court, she was poised and radiant. In politics, she was surgical. She stood firm through papal condemnations, rival claimants to the throne, and more than a few personal vendettas. And still, she never apologized for the way she ruled, or for how she loved. Some described her as enchanting. Others said she was deadly. A select few, often those with fewer pulse beats remaining, might have whispered both. Her reign unfolded like a play written by both Shakespeare and Machiavelli, equal parts romance and war. Her story ends not with a quiet farewell, but a violent goodbye. Strangled, likely by those who feared or envied her, she died as she had lived, surrounded by suspicion, poetry, and power. But her name didn't disappear with her final breath. Instead, it wove itself into songs, stories, and court gossip for generations. Joanna didn't simply occupy a throne. She transformed it into a stage, and her life into the performance no one dared look away from. To speak of Eleanor of Aquitaine is to summon a woman who didn't merely survive the 12th century. She bent it to her will. From the wind-swept hills of southern France to the candle-lit halls of English castles, her name reverberated not as a whisper, but as a declaration. Crowned twice, once in France and again in England, Eleanor wasn't content with the ceremonial silence expected of queens. She strode into history like a hawk in flight, beautiful, proud, and impossible to ignore. At just 15, she married Louis of France, a man devout in faith and dull in spirit. Their union was less a love story and more a tragic misunderstanding of chemistry. Louis believed in pilgrimage and penitence. Eleanor believed in poetry, pleasure, and power. The tension between them reached its boiling point on the Second Crusade, a journey he imagined would save their souls, and she likely hoped would save their marriage. It did neither. As they trudged across arid deserts and through hostile lands, Louis fasted and prayed while Eleanor, ever the aristocrat, surrounded herself with song, silk, and the intoxicating company of her own uncle, a charming prince with far more charisma than her husband ever managed. The rumors that followed them out of Antioch were as ripe as the fruit of the Levant, and just as hard to conceal. By the time the couple returned to Europe, their marriage was not just strained, it was broken beyond repair. Their union, once blessed by bishops, ended with an annulment wrapped in royal courtesy and quiet relief. But Eleanor didn't retire into shadow. She galloped back to Aquitaine, her lands, her people, and, within months, into a new marriage with a man who would one day become King Henry II of England. He was 11 years her junior, brash, red-haired, volatile, a flame to her wind. They were equals in wit, temper, and ambition. Their partnership birthed not just 10 children, but a dynasty, a cultural renaissance, and no shortage of domestic strife. Court poets wrote of Eleanor's radiant beauty and sharp tongue, while chroniclers struggled to keep pace with the firestorms of drama that ignited in her wake. She wasn't content to simply produce heirs. In her court at Poitiers, Eleanor nurtured a new form of expression, courtly love, a poetic tradition where knights pined for noble ladies, weaving their desires into verse, song, and subtle touches behind heavy curtains. Her palace became a haven for the romantic and the reckless, a sanctuary for passion disguised as art. But passion had its price. As Henry's affections wandered, as they always did, Eleanor didn't cry into a goblet or wilt like a neglected rose. Instead, she encouraged her sons to rise against their father. A rebellion brewed not in back alleys, but in royal chambers, and Eleanor helped stir the pot. The betrayal cut deep. Henry, never one to forgive lightly, had her arrested. For 16 years, the queen who once led armies and inspired sonnets sat under lock and key in distant castles. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor was not defeated. She wrote letters that brimmed with insight and strategy. She plotted, advised, remembered. When Henry finally died, it was she who guided their son, Richard the Lionheart, onto the throne. She rode at the front of political missions well into her 70s, a regal shadow behind every major decision in Western Europe. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't simply live in her age. She defined it. She wasn't a relic of chivalry, but its author. A queen twice over, a mother to kings, and a force that refused to be forgotten. If appearances were enough to define a queen, Margaret of Burgundy would have earned nothing but praise. She fit the mold perfectly. Royal blood, an elegant demeanor, and the grace expected of a woman destined to stand beside a king. Her posture was impeccable, her wardrobe luxurious, and her court manners beyond reproach. Yet beneath the velvet and virtue lay a restlessness that neither status nor ceremony could soothe. Her marriage to Louis, the heir to the French throne, was not born of love, nor even of mutual respect. Louis, later known as Louis VI, was a man whose enthusiasm never quite matched his obligations. Wooden in temperament and dull in conversation, he spoke of taxes with the same fervor poets gave to romance. To Margaret, a woman of charm and intellect, this was less a marriage than a slow suffocation. And then came the scandal. The year was 1314. France, unaware of the storm brewing within its own royal walls, would soon be shaken by what came to be known as the Tour de Nesle affair, a tale of secrecy, betrayal, and the kind of foolishness that could only end in ruin. Margaret and her sister-in-law Blanche began receiving visits, not from diplomats or ladies-in-waiting, but from 2 dashing Norman knights whose allegiance seemed more to desire than to duty. The rendezvous took place in the Tour de Nesle, a secluded tower near the Seine. It was the perfect setting for hidden passion, quiet, dim, and thick with shadow. But discretion is a fragile thing in a castle full of prying eyes and bored servants. The affair might have remained a rumor if not for a single, foolish oversight. The pillowcases. The knights, emboldened perhaps by the thrill of royal affection, flaunted fine linens too similar, suspiciously similar, to those from the royal bedchambers. It was the servants who noticed first, not court spies or secret informants. No, it was the staff, the very people who scrubbed floors and fetched cloaks, who made the connection. In a twist of almost comedic irony, it was luxury laundry that unraveled a queen. Once the truth, or at least the suspicion, reached King Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law, mercy evaporated. The knights were arrested, tortured, and executed with the theatrical brutality that medieval justice so often preferred. Their deaths served not only as punishment, but as a public warning. No one, not even the favored of queens, was above suspicion. Margaret's fate was quieter but no less cruel. She was imprisoned in the stone-cold fortress of Chateau Gaillard, a place as bleak as its name. There, without trial or comfort, she withered. Some say she died of illness. Others whisper suffocation, arranged not by nature, but by politics. Whether her death was slow or swift, merciful or malicious, one truth remains: she never lived to see her husband crowned king. What was her real crime? Not treason, not magic, not rebellion. Her greatest offense was seeking warmth in the wrong arms, beneath the wrong roof, on the wrong linens. And in a world where queens were measured not by joy, but by obedience, that was more than enough. Margaret of Burgundy wasn't a villain. She wasn't even a heroine. She was something far more dangerous in her time, a woman who acted on her desires, and for that, history folded her away into the shadows. Isabella of France was born into privilege, cloaked in silk and silver before she could even speak. A princess by birth, a queen by marriage, and a legend by force of will. Her story begins not with romance, but with calculation, a union forged for diplomacy, not desire. At the age of 12, she was wedded to Edward II of England, a man who, while tall and handsome, seemed to reserve his affections for others, most notably men who were not his wife. From the moment she crossed the Channel and stepped into her new life, Isabella understood that her husband's heart was already spoken for. His companion, Piers Gaveston, was not just a close friend. He was lavished with titles, lands, and jewels, including some that should have adorned the Queen herself. At the coronation banquet, it was Gaveston, not Isabella, who drew every eye, glittering like a peacock beside the king. Isabella noticed. Everyone noticed. Gaveston's rise was meteoric, and so too was his fall. The nobility, insulted and enraged by his arrogance and unchecked power, acted. He was exiled, recalled, and ultimately executed. Whether Isabella mourned or merely observed remains unclear. But whatever grief Edward bore was quickly redirected to another favorite, Hugh Despenser. Despenser made Gaveston look tame. His greed was insatiable, his ambition razor-edged. He took lands from noble families, turned allies into enemies, and did not hesitate to publicly undermine the Queen. He stripped Isabella of influence, humiliated her in court, and tightened his grip on her husband with a smirk that dared anyone to stop him. But Isabella was no shrinking violet. She endured the indignities in silence, until she didn't. In 1326, under the pretense of diplomacy, she left England with her young son, the future Edward III, and headed to her homeland of France. There she met Roger Mortimer, a man recently escaped from the Tower of London, carrying a rebellious streak and a bold vision. Together they plotted not escape, but conquest. What followed was a stunning reversal of fortune. With the backing of French support and English dissenters, Isabella and Mortimer launched an invasion. It was swift, it was clean, and it worked. Edward II was captured. Despenser was executed, and for a time Isabella ruled as regent, sharing authority, and likely more, with Mortimer. But power, once seized, rarely stays still. Whispers of Edward II's death followed her. Some said he died of illness in a quiet cell. Others told darker tales, of instruments, of screams, of a red-hot poker wielded not by accident, but by design. Historians have debated the truth for centuries. What remains is the suspicion and the stain it left behind. Isabella's regency didn't last. Her son, grown now and hungry for his own crown, saw in Mortimer not a trusted advisor, but a threat. In a sudden turn of justice, Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella, spared the same fate, was sent into retirement. Not to a dungeon, but to a gilded quietude far from the court she once commanded. And so the queen who had unseated a king and ruled a realm lived out her final days in relative comfort. But her legacy, sharp, scandalous, unforgettable, endured. She entered history as a wronged wife. She left it as a sovereign in her own right. Isabella of France was no passive consort. She was strategy wrapped in silk, vengeance laced with grace, and proof that even in a man's world, a woman with enough nerve could topple a throne. Agnes of Navarre was born into a world where poetry was as sharp as politics and affection could be as calculated as war. She belonged to a dynasty where power was stitched into every hem and every smile could hide 100 motives. Raised among troubadours and nobles, she learned early that beauty was currency, and charm, when wielded precisely, could be as deadly as any blade. Her marriage into the royal house of Aragon should have been a triumph, an alliance forged between kingdoms, a union destined to bring peace. But her husband, James IV of Aragon, proved to be less a king and more a storm of instability. His moods were erratic, his temper violent, and his mind often unanchored from reality. He accused shadows of plotting treason and once reportedly flew into a rage over the curtains, claiming they whispered against him. Agnes, poised and pragmatic, saw quickly that royal vows meant little if spoken to a man unmoored from sanity. And so she adapted. Agnes turned away from her husband and toward those who understood her language, men of music, strength, and poetry, knights with earnest eyes, courtiers who sang when they spoke, even, it was rumored, a monk whose vows had wilted in her presence. She never flaunted her lovers. She didn't need to. The whispers that echoed through the stone corridors of the palace did the work for her. And if anyone questioned her, they did so quietly, and only once. She was careful, clever, but even the most delicate secrets fray under the weight of envy and rumor. Servants began to talk. Faces turned toward her with curious smiles, and those who crossed her, who whispered a little too loudly or smirked a little too knowingly, often met strange ends. A maid found drowned, though she could swim. A rival noblewoman who choked on a sweet at a feast. One courtier who simply vanished, last seen walking too close to the edge of a very full moat. Was Agnes responsible? No charges were ever brought, no trials ever held. But the kitchen staff began locking their spice cabinets when she passed, and the priest kept his sermons conveniently vague when she sat in the front row. When James finally died, by natural causes, surprisingly, Agnes did not weep in public. She retired to a convent, not out of guilt or grief, but tradition. Noble women were expected to fade into holy silence after scandal. And so she did, sort of. Within the cloistered walls, she found not repentance, but reprieve. No more masks, no more men to outwit, just quiet, and women who asked no questions. She never remarried. Some say no one dared to ask. Others believe she simply found peace in her solitude, surrounded by candles, psalms, and memories wrapped in silk and shadows. She left behind no heirs, but the scent of her legend lingered like perfume in an empty room. Agnes of Navarre didn't seize crowns or lead armies. Her power was whispered, not declared. But in every court that remembered her name, she remained a warning. Never underestimate the woman who learns how to survive when love and loyalty have both turned to poison. Joanna of Castile was born into royalty. groomed for diplomacy and destined to reign. But beneath the jeweled veil of power, her story unraveled into a haunting saga of love, obsession, and grief that refused to die, even when the object of her devotion did. From an early age, Joanna had all the makings of a powerful monarch. Daughter to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, she was intelligent, politically trained, and fluent in multiple languages. But when she met Philip of Burgundy, known across Europe as Philip the Handsome, her carefully trained composure gave way to something far more dangerous: passion. He was everything a court could admire. Tall, golden-haired, with the roguish charm of a man who had never been told no. To Joanna, he was more than a husband. He became her obsession. Their early days were ablaze with desire, the kind that draws stares across banquet halls and whispers through silk drapes. But Philip's love, if it ever truly existed, came with conditions. Chief among them, freedom. He strayed from their marriage almost immediately, seducing courtiers and handmaidens with casual cruelty. Joanna, once poised and regal, began to spiral. Her jealousy took on a sharp edge. She interrogated, raged, lashed out, not with royal restraint, but with raw desperation. When her suspicions weren't enough, she made accusations. When accusations failed, she watched and waited, eyes sharp as daggers, looking for the next betrayal. Then, one day in 1506, Philip collapsed and died. Abruptly, inexplicably, allegedly after drinking cold water following a game of bowls. The official explanation was flimsy even by medieval standards. Joanna, devastated and disbelieving, refused to let go. Literally. She kept his body. Not just for a funeral, but indefinitely. She ordered the coffin opened repeatedly to make sure he was still inside, still hers. She kissed his cold lips. She slept beside the casket, and in a macabre twist, she forbade other women from even looking at the corpse, claiming that Philip's beauty, even in death, might tempt them. No one was safe from her suspicion. Not even the nuns. Not even the wind. For months, she journeyed across Castile with the coffin, stopping at monasteries, refusing burial, demanding prayers. The stories became stranger with each passing week. Some said she talked to him at night. Others claimed she believed he would rise again. Whether these tales were fact, exaggeration, or political slander hardly mattered. The damage to her reputation was done. Her father, Ferdinand, eventually stepped in. Declaring her mentally unfit, he confined her to a convent. There, for 46 years, Joanna remained, more a shadow than a sovereign. Her titles were stripped, her children were raised without her, and though her body aged, her legend remained frozen, as if time itself couldn't decide whether she had lost her mind or merely refused to surrender her heart. Historians still argue, was she truly mad, or was she a woman driven to the edge by betrayal, grief, and the suffocating isolation of power without control? Whatever the truth, Joanna of Castile didn't become a queen remembered for law or conquest. She became a myth wrapped in mourning. Her legacy wasn't written in decrees or battles. It was carved into the collective memory of Europe as a cautionary tale. Love can crown you, and love can undo you, and sometimes heartbreak leaves a stronger mark than history ever intended. Catherine was not born to rule Russia, nor was she born Russian at all. She came into the world as a minor German princess, a footnote in a ledger of noble bloodlines, unremarkable in name, but destined to become unforgettable in power. Her journey to the Russian throne was not a matter of divine right or smooth succession. It was a masterclass in survival, ambition, and patience sharpened into a weapon. When she married Peter, the future Tsar, she stepped into a union that felt more like a mistake than a coronation. He was immature, obsessed with toy soldiers, and embarrassingly enamored with all things Prussian. hardly the ideal monarch for a land built on snow, steel, and shadows. While Peter played pretend in his model barracks, Catherine learned. She studied Russian politics, history, and the Orthodox Church. She read philosophy and spoke to generals. She was not waiting for her moment. She was crafting it. She did not suffer in silence, nor did she cling to a cold marriage like a dutiful ghost. Instead, she took lovers, many of them officers, poets, nobles, men of strength and subtlety. Her affections were not careless. They were chosen, strategic. A lover could become a weapon, or a shield, or a memory quickly discarded. Some were rewarded with lands and titles, others vanished into quiet exile. Catherine's affections were transactional, but never hollow. Each served a purpose. Yet for all her lovers and all her political maneuvering, the shadow of scandal clung to her, none greater than the absurd, grotesque rumor that she had died attempting to mate with a horse. The story was as vile as it was impossible, a lie so outrageous it should have been laughed into obscurity. But it endured because Catherine had done what few women in power could. She ruled without a man. She didn't serve an empire. She commanded it, and for some the only way to process that was to bury her in filth and fantasy. The truth was far more compelling. Catherine rose through a coup that deposed her husband. When Peter finally wore the crown, he didn't keep it long. A carefully orchestrated takeover, backed by the military, supported by influential nobles, and possibly nodded along by Catherine herself, swept her into power. Peter died shortly after, under mysterious circumstances. She did not flinch. Her reign was long, prosperous, and unrelenting. She expanded Russia's borders, modernized its administration, and flirted with Enlightenment ideals while keeping a firm grip on her autocracy. She navigated plagues, wars, and palace intrigue with the precision of a chess master who always seemed 5 moves ahead, and she never once apologized for who she was or how she ruled. She died in her bed of a stroke, fully clothed and surrounded by the trappings of a life that had remade an empire. The horse story? Nothing more than slander, a final gasp of a society unable to believe that a woman could ride the winds of history without being dragged by them. Catherine the Great did not need to borrow power. She generated it. She did not live quietly or die modestly. And when the world tried to reduce her to myth, she outlived the rumor and claimed the legend instead. Anne Boleyn didn't arrive at the English court like a queen in waiting. She entered like a spark in a dry forest, uninvited, unexpected, and utterly transformative. Unlike the pale, quiet women who often hovered in the background of kings, Anne made herself impossible to ignore. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by the standards of her time, but she possessed something rarer: presence, a sharp wit, a knowing glance, a voice that didn't tremble when it cut through a room full of powdered courtiers. King Henry VIII noticed her almost instantly. How could he not? She wasn't like the others. She didn't chase his favor or melt beneath his compliments. Instead, she challenged him. She teased, delayed, refused. And in doing so, she became irresistible. Henry, already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, became obsessed not just with Anne's body, but with the idea of her. She wasn't merely a mistress. She was a possibility, a new chapter, a crown worth tearing a kingdom apart for, and tear it he did. Henry pursued her for nearly 7 years, writing passionate letters, filled with longing and barely veiled desperation. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry broke with Rome. He didn't just end a marriage, he ended centuries of religious unity. He created the Church of England, naming himself its supreme head, all for a woman who said no until the crown was within reach. Anne became queen in a blaze of triumph and controversy, but victory, as she soon discovered, was a fleeting guest. She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no sons. The court, always hungry for drama, turned on her. What had once been charming, her sharp tongue, her independence, her unwillingness to flatter, now became ammunition. Rumors began to swirl, absurd and sinister. Infidelity, witchcraft, even incest. None of it needed to be true. It only needed to be useful. Henry, ever impatient with disappointment, grew cold. Anne, once the center of his universe, now found herself encircled by enemies. Her trial was a farce. Judges who had already decided her fate, witnesses coaxed into perjury, and charges that seemed plucked from the fevered dreams of her detractors. She was convicted, of course. Executed by sword, a courtesy imported from France. Clean, efficient, regal. Even her death had to match the spectacle of her rise. Anne Boleyn died on a scaffold, but her legacy did not. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would grow to become one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling with the same fire that once lit Anne's eyes. And history, no matter how bloodied, could not forget the queen who refused to be anyone's mistress, who demanded a crown and paid for it with her head. Christina of Denmark knew exactly how to play the game. Not by grabbing crowns or conquering lands, but by knowing when to say no, with grace, with wit, and with just enough bite to leave an entire royal court speechless. She was born into Danish royalty in the early 16th century, daughter to nobility, niece to emperors. At 16, she was already a widow, her first husband, the Duke of Milan, dying not long after their marriage. But rather than mourn, Christina found herself in an unexpected position of power. As a young, wealthy widow in a world ruled by dynasties and deals, she became one of Europe's most sought-after brides. And then came Henry VIII. Recently divorced, violently, publicly, and fatally, from his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry was already infamous across the continent. His quest for a new queen led him to Christina. Eager to assess her appeal, he didn't send a letter or an envoy. He sent Hans Holbein, the court's most famous painter, to immortalize her beauty on canvas. A royal portrait, not for display, but for inspection. Christina understood exactly what it meant. She studied the offer, weighed the risk, and smiled with the kind of precision that only the truly clever possess. Then she delivered one of the most legendary refusals in royal matchmaking history. "If I had two heads," she said, "I would gladly put one at the disposal of the King of England." It was a rejection so elegant and devastating that it echoed across Europe. Christina didn't just say no, she carved it into marble with a wink. Henry was not amused. His court tried to save face, spinning excuses and alternative suitors, but Christina had made her decision. She would not become wife number 3, nor execution number 3. Instead, she chose wisely. She married Francis I, Duke of Lorraine, a man with no known beheading habits and a solid reputation. The match brought her safety, political influence, and the rare luxury of a husband who didn't treat marriage as a prelude to a trial. Later, when he died young, Christina took the reins herself, serving as regent for her son and managing the affairs of state with competence and command. She lived comfortably, collected art, advised nobles, and never once regretted dodging Henry's axe. While other women's names were etched in scandal or tragedy, Christina's became a byword for survival through intellect. She knew the dangers of courtly flattery, the false promises of kings, and the cost of ignoring a red flag when it's wearing a crown. Christina of Denmark never ruled a kingdom, but she outlived the man who wanted to own her, ruled in her own way, and left behind a legacy sharpened not by war, but by one perfectly timed, perfectly barbed sentence. Maria of Portugal entered her marriage like so many noble women of her time, draped in duty, heavy with expectation, and largely forgotten by the man she called husband. She had the title, the grace, the pedigree. But what she lacked, painfully and publicly, was her husband's heart. Her union with Alfonso VI of Castile should have secured her power. Instead, It made her a political ornament. Alfonso, a king shaped by battlefields and pride, treated Maria not as a partner, but as an obligation. His affections were reserved for another, Leonor de Guzman, a noble woman who, unlike Maria, captured not only his attention but his presence, at court, in public, and in the chronicles of the time. Leonor wasn't hidden, she wasn't denied, she was flaunted. While Maria bore the legitimate heir, Peter, who would become king in his own right, Leonor gave Alfonso 10 illegitimate children and was treated as if she were queen in all but name. Maria watched from the shadows of her own palace, excluded, humiliated, and burned by the slow agony of political and emotional displacement. She was a queen whose crown came with no voice. But death, as it so often did in medieval courts, reshuffled the game. When Alfonso died, the palace doors no longer held Maria at a distance. She returned to Portugal with her teenage son, not merely as a widow, but as a mother with a mission. With Alfonso gone, Maria turned her gaze inward, toward Peter. He became her purpose, her anchor, and some whispered, her obsession. Peter, now king, found love with Inés de Castro, a woman Maria found wholly unacceptable. Some said it was because Inés came from a less powerful noble house. Others whispered that Maria's objections ran deeper, that no woman would ever be good enough to take the place Maria had never been allowed to fully occupy in Alfonso's life. What happened next remains one of the most disturbing love stories in Iberian history. Inés was murdered, and Maria's name loomed darkly in the aftermath. Some claimed she orchestrated it. Others believed she simply turned her head the other way. Regardless, Peter's response was nothing short of operatic vengeance. Consumed by grief and rage, he declared that Inés had been his wife all along. He dug up her body, dressed it in royal robes, and placed her corpse on the throne. Courtiers were forced to kneel before her, kissing the decomposed hand of a woman Maria had tried to erase. Did Maria order the killing? History offers no certainty. But her silence, her fury, her unwavering proximity to power made her a prime suspect in a drama so personal it bled into legend. In her later years, Maria receded from the court. Her role diminished, but her name forever tethered to one of the most grotesque love stories of medieval Europe. Some say she grew eccentric, possibly unwell. She referred to herself as Empress in private letters, perhaps out of delusion, or perhaps as a desperate grasp at the dignity denied her for so long. Maria of Portugal never became the beloved queen she may have imagined, but she carved out a legacy, not in policy or glory, but in sorrow, in maternal domination, and in a haunting caution about what happens when a woman is denied love, respect, and power for too long. When Prince Igor of Kiev was torn limb from limb by the Drevlians, his body tied to bent trees and then released in a grotesque display of political murder, they expected Olga, his wife, to weep, retreat, and eventually remarry one of them. It was the natural order of things in the 10th century. A widow, vulnerable and alone, would bow to a stronger tribe for protection. What they didn't understand, what they failed to see, was that Olga was not a woman to mourn quietly. She was a storm in human form, and she would make them pay, one calculated horror at a time. First, she received the Drevlian envoys graciously. They arrived with arrogance, proposing that she become the wife of their prince, as if her husband's mutilation were merely a formality. She nodded, smiled, promised to consider. Then she had them buried alive, boats and all, in a massive trench dug while they slept. She wasn't finished. She sent word to the Drevlians, "Send more suitors, this time your nobles." When they arrived, she greeted them warmly, offering them a bathhouse to rest and cleanse before the meeting. Once they were inside, she locked the doors and set it ablaze. Screams rose with the smoke. Still, she wasn't done. Olga then traveled to the Drevlian capital herself, under the guise of peace. She requested a funeral feast in Igor's honor, a gesture of closure, she claimed. The Drevlians, perhaps deluded by the idea that the worst was over, hosted a lavish banquet. Olga let them drink, celebrate. Then, when the wine had done its work, her soldiers descended, slaughtering thousands. Not warriors, not generals, civilians, elders, the heart of the city, torn out in one night. And still, it wasn't enough. The surviving Drevlians, finally desperate, begged for mercy. Olga offered terms. Each household must send her a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows. A humble request, they thought. So they complied. She took the birds, tied sulfur-soaked cloth to their legs, and released them back into the city. The birds flew home, to rooftops, to barns, to the wooden beams of homes, and when the cloths were lit, the city burned from within, every bird a tiny spark of vengeance. No army, no siege, just fire, precision, and the cold fury of a widow who refused to be anyone's victim. Olga did not flirt with vengeance. She orchestrated it, coldly, brilliantly, and with an efficiency that would leave even the most seasoned generals in awe. And then, after all the blood, the smoke, the terror, she converted to Christianity. Yes, the same woman who reduced cities to ash using birds would later be canonized as a saint. Saint Olga of Kiev. The paradox of history never felt more poetic. In her later years, she ruled as regent for her son, governing with wisdom, order, and a ruthlessness that no one dared question again. The church praised her piety, the people honored her strength, but her enemies remembered only the fire and the birds. Olga of Kiev didn't ask for revenge. She became it. Lucrezia Borgia never wore a queen's crown, but she ruled as if she had invented it. Born in 1480 into the infamous Borgia family, where secrets were as common as servants and poison was just another spice, she moved through the palaces of Renaissance Italy like a character from a myth, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to pin down. Her father wasn't just any nobleman. He was Rodrigo Borgia, a man who would become Pope Alexander VI, a walking contradiction in robes. He was a man of God, yet fathered children with the enthusiasm of a tavern drunk. And Lucrezia, his daughter, became both pawn and player in the family's grand designs. Her marriages were never her own. She was traded like currency, each alliance a stepping stone in the Vatican's sprawling web of influence. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, was unceremoniously discarded when he outlived his usefulness. The Borgia family pressured him to annul the marriage by claiming it had never been consummated, an elegant way of declaring him inadequate in bed. Publicly. Loudly. Lucrezia said nothing. She didn't need to. Then came a darker chapter. Rumors swirled through the marble halls and candlelit salons, rumors of a hollow ring laced with poison, of a secret child born in shadow, of an unnatural closeness with her brother Cesare that scandalized even jaded Rome. Was any of it true? Likely not. But in Renaissance Italy, truth mattered less than the elegance of the gossip, and Lucrezia's story was deliciously baroque. She married again to Alfonso of Aragon. Young, handsome, and unfortunately expendable. When he crossed her brother's ambitions, Alfonso was stabbed in the streets and later strangled in his bed while recovering. Lucrezia was allegedly nearby, weeping perhaps, watching more likely. Yet for all her darkness, real or imagined, Lucrezia had a mind sharpened by survival. She spoke multiple languages, patronized artists and poets, and ruled Ferrara as duchess with grace, intelligence, and a rare ability to inspire loyalty. The court she built rivaled any in Italy for culture and refinement. She hosted masked balls, commissioned operas, and transformed the reputation of her house from whispered scandal to admired majesty. She aged into dignity, wrapped not in myth but in velvet and governance. The woman, once accused of seduction and sorcery, ended her days overseeing charity work, writing letters filled with political wisdom, and raising children in the echo of a turbulent name. Lucrezia Borgia remains a riddle history can't quite solve. Was she a femme fatale, poisoned by her family's ambitions? Or was she merely a woman trying to survive in a world that weaponized beauty and bloodlines alike? Perhaps she was both, because in the end, her greatest weapon wasn't poison, it was ambiguity. And history, unable to define her, could only ever be haunted by her smile. Wu Zetian entered the imperial palace not with fanfare, but with silence. One of many young concubines in the sprawling, perfumed ranks of Emperor Taizong's harem, she was a teenage girl surrounded by politics, poetry, and peril. At first glance, she was unremarkable, a delicate face among dozens, a name scribbled in the margins of the Tang dynasty's endless court records. But Wu watched. She listened. She remembered. When the emperor died, tradition demanded that childless concubines like her be sent to a Buddhist convent to fade quietly into prayer and obscurity. Wu went briefly. Then she returned, not through rebellion, but seduction. She caught the eye of Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong. Yes, her former stepson, a scandalous twist even by imperial standards. But Wu wasn't looking for approval. She was looking for power. Once back in the palace, she began to clear the path ahead. Rivals were accused of crimes, real or invented. Political enemies were quietly removed, their careers undone by whispers and signatures. Even the empress herself fell, replaced not with another passive ornament, but with Wu, who wore the title with intention. She wasn't content to stand beside the throne. She wanted to sit on it. When Emperor Gaozong became ill, Wu stepped in, not as a nurse, but as a shadow ruler. She issued decrees in his name, restructured the court, placed allies in key positions, and when he finally died, she didn't retreat into widowhood. She rose, shedding her titles like old silk. She declared herself emperor. Not empress, not regent, emperor. A title no woman had ever claimed in China. She wore the dragon robes, sat on the imperial dais, and carved her name into history with the ink of law and the blood of anyone who stood in her way. Her reign was marked by both progress and fear. Agriculture flourished, the civil service expanded. Scholars and officials rose by merit rather than birth. But dissenters vanished. Critics died. Even her own children were not safe if they threatened her grip. One daughter was rumored to have been killed by Wu herself, framed on purpose to eliminate the previous empress. Whether truth or political slander, the tale clung to her legacy like smoke. And then came the stories, always the stories, of secret lovers hidden behind palace screens, of orgies in the Forbidden City, of a golden box used for tortures too cruel to detail. It didn't matter that many of these tales were likely born from fear, misogyny, or outright fiction. A woman ruling China could not simply be competent. She had to be accused of magic, of madness, of monstrous appetites. Wu ignored them all. She ruled for more than 40 years, longer than many male emperors, and died in her 80s, unheard of in a court where youth often died before legacy. Her name was nearly erased by the men who came after. Her tomb, grand as it was left without an inscription, as if history itself had to pause, uncertain how to define a woman who had shattered every rule it tried to apply. But her silence on stone only deepened the power of her memory. Wu Zetian didn't inherit power. She took it, and she held it not with flirtation or scandal, but with brilliance, brutality, and the iron will of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. and how high the cost would be. When Empress Matilda crossed the storm-tossed English Channel in 1139, she came not as a beggar or a bride, but as a rightful heir returning to reclaim her crown. She was the daughter of a king, the widow of an emperor, and a woman who had been promised a throne and then watched it slip through her fingers. Her father, Henry I of England, had named her his successor after the death of her only brother. Every noble in the realm had sworn loyalty to her. But when Henry died, those oaths dissolved like mist. The crown did not go to Matilda. It went to her cousin Stephen, a man pleasant enough in temperament, but weak in will and cunning in ambition. He moved fast, seized the treasury, and declared himself king before Matilda could even put on her mourning veil. To the barons, it was simple. A man, any man, was preferable to a woman with authority. But Matilda was not a woman who yielded. She did not accept betrayal with quiet grace. She did not hide in foreign courts and weep over stolen power. Instead, she launched a war, an open, bitter, brutal civil war that tore England apart for nearly 2 decades. They called it the Anarchy. But for Matilda, it was a reckoning. She landed in England, raised armies, captured cities. She was cunning on the battlefield and cold in negotiation. And in 1141, she did what few believed possible. She captured Stephen. The King of England became her prisoner. At last, the crown seemed within reach. But the coronation never came. Matilda's triumph unraveled not on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. When she entered London, she was met not with cheers, but resentment. She was proud, sharp-tongued. She demanded obedience, not affection. She refused to play the role of a soft-spoken sovereign. The people turned, the lords hesitated, the tides shifted. Stephen's supporters regrouped. Matilda was forced to flee in disguise, her dreams of ruling slipping further away with every mile. Still, she did not fade. She continued the war, even as fortunes shifted. She watched her allies fall, her forces dwindle, and her reputation wither under a campaign of slander. But she played the long game, not for herself, but for her son, Henry. She raised him, educated him, forged him into the weapon she could no longer be. And when the dust of civil war finally settled, it was Henry who emerged as the next king, Henry II, founder of the mighty Plantagenet dynasty. Through him, Matilda's bloodline would stretch across centuries. Kings, queens, wars, conquests, all sprung from the woman denied a crown. Empress Matilda never ruled in name, but she ruled in legacy. History tried to paint her as arrogant, as unfeminine, as unreasonable. But what was unreasonable, really, about a woman demanding what was rightfully hers? What was unladylike about ambition in a world where men killed brothers and betrayed fathers to claim power? Matilda didn't fail. She reshaped the monarchy from behind the veil of scandal, steel, and maternal vision. And though she never wore the English crown, her fingerprints remained on every jewel. Cleopatra did not arrive in history shrouded in mystery. She carved herself into it, one decision, one alliance, one seduction at a time. She was not simply beautiful, she was brilliant, fluent in over a dozen languages, a philosopher, a strategist, a woman who read Homer at dawn and negotiated with Roman generals by dusk. When her father died, Cleopatra ascended to the throne not alone but alongside her brother, husband, as Egyptian tradition demanded. But power shared is rarely power held, and Cleopatra was never meant to be half a monarch. She was exiled, ousted, nearly erased. So she returned, not with an army, but with a carpet. The legend is nearly unbelievable. Cleopatra, smuggled into Julius Caesar's palace, wrapped in cloth, unfurled at his feet like a gift to destiny. It wasn't just seduction, it was political theater. The gamble of a woman who understood that appearances, especially in a world of men, could be weapons sharper than any blade. Caesar was captivated. Rome, less so. She bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, and ruled Egypt with strength and vision. But when Caesar fell to knives in the Roman Senate, Cleopatra's world cracked open. She fled back to Alexandria, heart hardened, gaze shifting toward a new rising star in Rome, Mark Antony. Antony was bold, brash, and adored in the East, and Cleopatra, she was magnetic, enigmatic, untouchable. Their alliance, romantic and political, shook the foundations of Rome. Together, they threw feasts of unimaginable excess, sailed on golden barges, declared themselves Dionysus and Isis, reborn. They were gods playing at empire, but gods in the end bleed. Rome declared war, led by Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's rival. The Battle of Actium was not just a clash of fleets, but a reckoning of myth against machine. Cleopatra and Antony lost, and with that loss, the fate of Egypt was sealed. In Alexandria, surrounded by the crumbling remains of their dream, Antony fell on his sword. Dying, he was carried to Cleopatra, who still lived in her mausoleum, a structure she had begun building not as a tomb, but as a throne in waiting. When Octavian came to claim her, she denied him the victory of a Roman parade. She chose her death as she had lived her life, with theatrical mastery. Whether it was by asp, poison, or blade, we may never know. But when she died, Egypt died with her. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh, the last sovereign of an ancient civilization that had stood for millennia. And yet, she is not remembered as a ruler alone. She is remembered as a woman who dared to rule in her own right, who refused to bow, who matched the might of Rome with the cunning of her mind and the fire of her spirit. They wrote her as a temptress, a siren, a woman undone by love. But in truth, Cleopatra was a queen undone by empire, and remembered because she lived as if the world could still be hers. She was born a princess, married as a pawn, and remembered as a predator. Isabella of France entered the English court draped in silk and diplomacy. Daughter of King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, she was bred in the fire of Capetian politics, trained to move silently through the thorns of power. But when she crossed the Channel to marry Edward II of England, she stepped into a world colder than any she'd known. Edward was a king, but not the kind Isabella expected. He did not crave her presence, nor her counsel. His heart, if not his body, belonged to another, Piers Gaveston, a charming, arrogant favorite whose influence over the king was both absolute and scandalous. Edward showered Gaveston with gifts, titles, and the kind of loyalty he never extended to his queen. At her own coronation, Isabella was nearly eclipsed. Gaveston dressed more regally than the bride. The court whispered. The barons grew restless. Isabella watched. When Gaveston was finally executed by angry nobles, it was not the end. It was only a pause. Edward found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser, cruel, ambitious, and insatiable. The Despensers became Edward's shadow rulers. They exiled Isabella's allies, seized her lands, and treated the Queen of England as if she were an inconvenience. But Isabella was no passive consort. She had her father's blood, the cold, calculating resolve of a king who once expelled every Jew from France and crushed the Templars under royal boots. When England stripped her power, she turned abroad for it and found it in the arms of an exiled English noble, Roger Mortimer. Together, they formed a bond not just of passion, but of rebellion. In 1326, while England slept, Isabella and Mortimer sailed from France with a modest invasion force. What began as a whisper of insurrection erupted into full-scale collapse. Town after town opened its gates. Nobles defected. Even the king's own supporters abandoned him. The queen, once humiliated and dismissed, was now a banner of revolution. Edward fled with Hugh Despenser. They were captured, filthy and broken, hiding in a Welsh marsh. Despenser was sentenced to a traitor's death, dragged, hanged, castrated, disemboweled while still alive. His screams echoed as justice roared. And Edward? He was deposed. No king had ever been legally dethroned in England before. Isabella shattered precedent. Her son, Edward III, was crowned in his father's place, still a boy, still pliable. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents. For 4 years, they held the reins of power with velvet and iron. But power shared rarely endures. The young king grew restless. In 1330, barely 18, Edward III struck back. He arrested Mortimer and had him hanged as a traitor. Isabella, spared death, was confined to a royal estate, a gilded exile. She lived in wealth and comfort, but without a throne. Some say she went mad. Others claim she retired in peace. When she died decades later, her body was laid to rest with a heart-shaped silver casket upon her chest. Inside, they say, was the heart of Edward II, her husband, her enemy, her king. Was it love, guilt, or irony? History gave her a name fit for a beast, the she-wolf of France. But Isabella was not a monster. She was a woman born into a game where kings ruled carelessly and queens were expected to suffer in silence. She chose another path. She made kings kneel. She made history tremble. And when the world tried to brand her with teeth and claws, she didn't snarl. She smiled. They thought she would break. When Roman soldiers flogged her, when they raped her daughters, when they laughed at her crown and stole her lands, they thought Boudica, queen of the Iceni, would fall silent. They were wrong. She did not shatter. She sharpened. Boudica wasn't raised in marble halls or perfumed courts. She was forged in the mist and mud of ancient Britain, a land of stone circles, painted warriors, and ancestral fire. She ruled not by divine right, but by respect earned at the blade's edge. Her people followed her because she rode with them, bled beside them, and believed in something Rome could never understand: freedom, born wild. After the death of her husband, the Romans moved swiftly, claiming his kingdom despite his alliance. They beat Boudica in public. They violated her daughters. They treated her crown as a costume, her throne as a joke. And so she raised an army. Not a trained legion, not the polished machine of Roman conquest, but thousands of tribesmen, women, farmers, old warriors, united by grief, rage, and the voice of a queen who refused to die kneeling. She stood in her chariot, her long red hair flowing like blood down her back, eyes burning with fury as she called the tribes to war. And they came. What followed was not a battle, it was an inferno. She led her people to Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, a Roman colony built over sacred tribal ground. They burned it to ash. The Roman temple fell, screaming priests inside. Then Londinium, London. Then Verulamium, St. Albans. City after city fell. Roman governors fled. Soldiers were slaughtered. Civilians too. Some historians count the dead in the tens of thousands. To Boudica, they were debts, paid in full. Rome had never seen anything like her. The empire scrambled to respond. Governor Suetonius regrouped his legions. Boudica's army vastly outnumbered his, but it was wild and untrained. Rome's discipline clashed with native fury in a final bloody stand, likely somewhere along Watling Street. She lost. It wasn't for lack of will. It was the cold, brutal efficiency of Rome, honed over centuries, that broke the last charge. Her people were slaughtered. Her revolution bled out onto the soil she tried to save. And Boudica, some say she poisoned herself, choosing death over humiliation. Others say she slipped away into the forests, vanishing into legend. No one knows for sure, but her ghost still rides across the English countryside, her war cry echoing in every gale. She did not win, but she did not vanish. Rome survived. But it never forgot her. They called her a barbarian, a rebel, a madwoman. But history, real history, knows her truth. She was a queen who answered brutality with fire, a mother who made grief into a weapon, a woman who, for one blinding moment, made even an empire tremble.